All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us and welcome to Anderson House. My name is Andrew Alton and I'm the Historical Programs Manager for the American Revolution Institute of the Society of the Cincinnati. The American Revolution Institute promotes knowledge and appreciation for the achievement of American independence, fulfilling the aim of the Continental Army officers and their French counterparts who founded the Society of the Cincinnati in 1783 to perpetuate the memory and legacy of that vast event. In addition to tonight's authors talk, the American Revolution Institute fulfills that aim by supporting advanced study, developing exhibitions and other historical programs and tours, advocating historic preservation, and providing resources to classrooms nationwide that benefit teachers, students, and scholars alike. Since 1938, the Society of the Cincinnati has done all of this work from its headquarters right here at Anderson House, a National Historic Landmark that was completed in 1905 as the winter residence of Lars and Isabel Anderson here in Washington, D.C. Tonight's Authors Talk, a program that is made possible in part by a generous gift from the Massachusetts Society of the Cincinnati, features Dr. Jim Piecuch discussing his recent book, South Carolina Provincials, Loyalists in British Service During the American Revolution, and that was published recently by Westholme Publishing. The Loyalists who supported the British forces during the Revolutionary War have frequently been neglected in accounts of the conflict. Nevertheless, they've made significant efforts in attempting to restore royal authority in the 13 colonies, especially in South Carolina. Tonight, our focus and our attention will be directed to the South to take a look at South Carolina's Loyalists who took up arms to assist the American Rebellion in the South. Our speaker, Jim Piecuch, is a former professor of history at Kennesaw State University. He earned his BA and MA degrees in history at the University of New Hampshire and his PhD in history at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. Throughout his career, he has authored several articles and books on colonial and revolutionary history, including The Battle of Camden, a documentary history published by the History Press in 2006, Three Peoples, One King, Loyalist Indians and Slaves in the Revolutionary South, published by the University of South Carolina Press in 2008. And that was a book that won the Kennesaw State University's Foundation Prize in 2009. And also the Cavalry in the American Revolution, published by Westholme Publishing in 2012. And finally, General Nathaniel Greene and the American Revolution in the South, which he co-authored with fellow historian Gregory Massey. And that was published by the University of South Carolina Press in 2012. Now, before I turn things over to our speaker tonight, the usual housekeeping items are in order for our friends joining us virtually on Zoom this evening. Following the talk, there will be a question and answer session, so please feel free to submit your questions at any point during the presentation by using the Q&A function that can be found at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to incorporate them with our live audience questions. Should you have any technical related questions or comments, those can be submitted using the chat function, and one of our staff members will be monitoring that and will do their best to assist you as always. So without further delay, please join me in welcoming back to Anderson House our friend, Dr. Jim Piecuch.
Thank you, Andrew, for the introduction, and thanks to all of you for turning out tonight. I'd like to start actually with a definition of provincial troops. It's a term many of you have probably heard, but that some people aren't quite sure what it means. Provincial troops are troops raised by the British, but from the colonies. They are recruited, they are trained and equipped like regular British regiments, but except for some of the officers that are often drawn from regular British regiments to give them experienced leadership, they are colonists. But they are basically the equivalent of British regulars, except that they don't serve like most British regulars who ended up serving pretty much for life when they enlisted. Except in wartime, the British did have enlistments and recruitments for the duration of the war. So these are Americans. The idea of provincial troops was used in the colonial wars, the French and Indian War, and earlier wars. most of the earlier provincial troops for example, the French and Indian War came from New England. The British were sometimes reluctant based on that experience to recruit Americans as provincial troops because in the French and Indian War, the provincial troops had often not performed up to expectations. They resented regular army discipline. They resented being placed sometimes under regular British officers. But the British went back to raising provincial troops during the Revolution. And by roughly 1778, 1779, the provincial troops, not only those we're going to discuss, but others like the New York Volunteers, the New Jersey Volunteers, the Queen's Rangers, the British Legion, are every bit as effective fighters as regular British troops because of their training and commitment. So these are the units we're going to talk about. The largest provincial unit raised in South Carolina, and the first was the South Carolina Royalists. In 1780, another regiment was attempted, the South Carolina Rangers. And in 1781, they raised 3 troops. A troop is the cavalry equivalent of an infantry company of Provincial Light Dragoons, which are basically cavalry units. So these are the groups we're going to discuss. And we'll start with the Royalists because they were the first raised. Their origins can be traced to the 1775 Civil War, and it was a civil war in the South Carolina backcountry. There had been tensions for well over a decade between the backcountry people and the low country. The low country, primarily the home of the wealthy planters, think Laurens and Middleton and these families, they dominated the colonial legislature, and they made the laws to benefit themselves. They ignored the people in the backcountry until 1767, when, as had occurred in North Carolina, a regulator movement developed saying if the legislature in Charleston is not going to provide courts and jails and law enforcement, we will do this ourselves. That convinced the legislature to create 2 new voting districts in the backcountry and several court districts at places like 96 and Camden. But the backcountry voters had very limited access to polling places. There were only a couple of polling places, one in each of the big backcountry districts, so it was hard to get there to vote. And they had very few representatives. The smaller free population in the low country had far greater representation than the much larger free population in the backcountry. So there were a lot of tensions, and none of the backcountry residents had taken part in any of the earlier protests in the colony. Stamp Act didn't bother them. They weren't affected by it. You know, Townsend Acts, Tea Act, it just didn't bother them. They weren't affected. So all of the opposition to British policy in South Carolina had come from the coastal district, the low country. Well, after fighting breaks out at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts, now all of these other colonies are joining in to resist British rule. And people began to realize in the low country that they need some support from the backcountry. If the backcountry opposes them, they could have some serious problems. So they attempt to win over the backcountry people. And this gentleman you see here, William Henry Drayton, headed a 5-person mission to the backcountry in the summer of 1775 to win over the people there. He was accompanied by Oliver Hart, William Tennant, 2 ministers, and also Richard Richardson and Joseph Kershaw, who were militia officers in the backcountry area and who were men of some influence. Well, it did not go as planned. They did not win over many people. They would, try to explain their views, and they would be challenged by people like Joseph Robinson and Euan McLaurin, who later became Royalist officers, also by Thomas Brown and others who were just, coming out and giving, they had materials that the royal governor, Lord William Campbell, who had just arrived and was basically powerless, but he had sent the materials, pamphlets and documents outlining the British position. And these people, when Drayton and his crew pressed them to sign the Continental Association, pledging to support the Congress, instead, they asked Robinson to draw up a counter association, pledging their loyalty and their willingness to support the British. So Drayton started cracking down. Instead, when he realized he couldn't persuade people to join him, he decided to say, okay, we're not going to allow you to use the mills or to cross the rivers at the ferries or to go and use the courts, which were in Charleston. That was another problem. Imagine if you live in the backcountry in 96 and you have to travel 150 or 200 miles to Charleston if you have to go to court. It wasn't easy. So he said, we're going to bar you from the courts. So the resentment began increasing, and they created finally a truce on September 16th at 96. Thomas Fletchall was at the time the most influential man in the backcountry. He was the colonel of the militia regiment. He was a justice of the peace, and he really did not want armed conflict. So Drayton sort of took advantage of this. He had a meeting on September 16th between Drayton and Fletchall. McLaurin was there. A lot of people like Joseph Robinson and Thomas Brown stayed away because they were afraid that if they showed up, Drayton would try to have them seized and arrested. So they signed a treaty, and they pledged not, the Loyalists said, they were no longer going to be pressured or harassed to sign the Continental Association, but in exchange, they pledged not to assist the British or to oppose the revolutionary government in Charleston, headed by a group called the Council of Safety. It was the executive arm of it. So that was the agreement. Thomas Brown, Robert Cunningham, and others denounced it. They said this was imposed by intimidation. You took advantage of Fletchall, and some people said Fletchall was drunk when he signed it. Robinson did not sign it. He did not attend, but he apparently did not like the idea. But the truce didn't last, because in late October, Robert Cunningham was arrested by some of Drayton's people and brought to Charleston because he had refused to sign or support the association. So that was a violation of the treaty. And his brother, Patrick Cunningham, on October 31st, gathers about 150 Loyalists and seizes a wagon loaded with powder and lead. It's an interesting story because the powder and lead is not actually intended to be used against the Loyalists. The Cherokees have been allied with the British, and the Council of Safety wants to at least keep the Cherokees neutral so they don't have to worry about the frontier. So since they're blocking shipments of goods to the Cherokees, they said, well, we'll we'll send powder and lead to the Cherokees to keep them happy, and then they won't turn against us. So these munitions are intended for the Cherokees, but Patrick Cunningham says, no, they're going to use them against us. And you can't trust them. Look at what they did. They arrested my brother. And Richard Pierce, who was an Indian trader, also comes out and takes this side and says, yeah, they're going to use it. They're planning to use it against the Loyalists. So they seize this wagon with powder and lead, and that brings on armed conflict. Andrew Williamson, who is the backcountry revolutionary militia leader, although he has fewer followers than the Loyalist militia leaders at this time, calls out his militia. About 500 men turn out to reclaim the wagon. Joseph Robinson, who is Fletchall's second in command with Fletchall's blessing, calls out initially 2,000 Loyalist militia, but he will be joined by a few hundred more. Williamson marches to the town of 96, which is the major backcountry town, and learning that the Loyalists are coming after him, he begins to fortify the position, throwing up fence rails and things like that. It's not a great fortification. That's a view of 96 there. Robinson arrives on November 19th, surrounds Williamson's men, and begins a siege. Nothing really happens. There's a few shots exchanged back and forth. The Americans have to dig a well because they have no water. They finally manage to do that. They're also almost out of ammunition, but the Loyalists don't know that. Well, they try various ways to get in. They try to set fire to the grass in the field so that the smoke will cover an attack. It's damp and the fire doesn't get anywhere. One of Robinson's officers actually gets clever and builds an old type medieval siege device called a mantelet, like a wooden fort that you're supposed to push forward, roll it forward. And they start pushing it forward and it just gets stuck. So they end up burning it. So the American militia can't get it. But nobody really wants bloodshed at this time. Williamson is fairly moderate. Robinson is fairly moderate. They really don't want this neighbor against neighbor, brutal, bloody civil war if they can help it. So on November 22nd, they negotiate a treaty. Said both sides are going to disperse if they want. They can stay embodied if they want, but both commanders disperse their men. They'll go home and they're going to await some kind of resolution between the Council of Safety and the royal governor, Campbell. Well, what the Loyalists don't know is that Campbell has zero power, zero influence. The Council of Safety isn't going to listen to him unless maybe he wants to surrender to them and become a hostage. But they don't know that, so they hope there's going to be some kind of negotiated settlement. Well, that turns out to be a mistake because Williamson sends the copy of the treaty to the Council of Safety, and there's an interesting provision in it. It says everybody's going to stay neutral until this is resolved. Not only the forces that were actually engaging each other at 96, but also the forces that were coming from both sides to assist at 96. The Council of Safety reads that and they said, well, when Williamson signed that, he couldn't really have meant it. So these other units that are coming aren't governed by the provision. So these other militias, Richardson's and some North Carolina militia, show up. And instead of saying, like the treaty said, well, they're bound to neutrality, we're just going to turn around and go home and wait for a resolution, they sweep through in November and December what's known as the Snow Campaign. They arrest over 130 Loyalist leaders. They disarm hundreds of other Loyalists who are at home. Patrick Cunningham manages to get 200 or 300 men together, but they're short of arms, they're short of ammunition. And at Great Canebrake on December 21st, they are defeated. Cunningham escapes, but a lot of his men are captured. Robinson, McLaurin, and others, most of them have a price on their head now from the Council of Safety, and they managed to escape to Florida through Indian Territory. Henry Lawrence actually is very concerned that Robinson got away. He doesn't actually know even have the correct spelling of the guy's name, but he says, is this guy Robinson or Robertson or Robeson or whatever his name is? He says, we got to get him. We shouldn't let him get away. But he does. So East Florida, what's now the Florida Peninsula, is a British colony that remains loyal. West Florida, which is the Florida Panhandle and part of what's now Southern Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, also a British colony gained in 1763, also remain loyal. But Robinson and McLaurin are guided to these places by Allied Indians. British Allied Cherokees escort them through their territory to the Creeks. The Creeks then take over the escort duties. Robinson goes to St. Augustine. McLaurin goes first to Pensacola, then to St. Augustine, where he becomes an officer in the East Florida or King's Rangers. These are also largely South Carolina, Georgia refugees. under Thomas Brown, who had also had a price on his head, another South Carolinian. I didn't cover them because Ed Cashin wrote a biography of Brown that was also a unit history. But in East Florida, they have an advantage. This guy you see here is one of the unknown people of the Revolution, but very influential. His name is Patrick Tonin. He's a British Army officer. He's actually still on active duty. And he is extremely aggressive. He wants to carry the war to the rebels. He wants to use Indians if he can. He wants to use these loyalist refugees. He's willing to enroll enslaved people in the colony's militia, if that's what it takes to hold the ground while he's conducting offensive operations. He's constantly pressing his superiors, his civilian superiors in London, the military officers, Howe and Clinton. You've got to take aggressive action. You've got to take aggressive action. And so he does, first with Brown's Rangers, who are very effective raiding into southern Georgia in conjunction with Creek and Seminole Indians. So he is going to welcome more loyalists. In early April of 1778, the South Carolina Loyalists have had enough. And between 400 and 600, the accounts differ, get together. They plotted this out carefully. They've been in contact with other refugees in East Florida, and they get together. They march to the Savannah River and cross into Georgia, are joined by another 200 Georgia Loyalists, and they go all the way to St. Augustine. Try to get this pointer here. Whoops. Anyway, it's a distance of several hundred miles. So it's very risky, and these people leaving their homes, their families, everything. So that's a pretty strong commitment. Their leaders are Benjamin Gregory, John Murphy, George Dawkins, and Edward Lane. All of these had been active in the 1775 resistance. And they're motivated in large part because South Carolina, like many colonies, has passed confiscation acts and banishment acts. And what these say is, if you don't sign the oath of allegiance to the state and the Continental Congress by a certain date, you must leave the state. The state will confiscate half of your property, and you will be able to sell the other half to pay for your journey. But you have 30 days to sell it. Well, if you have to sell your property in 30 days and then leave, you think you're going to get the top price for it? If people know that's what that you have to sell? No. So they don't want to take the oath. They don't want, they know they're going to have to leave anyway, so we might as well go. The Banishment Acts also said if you came back, you'd be executed immediately on your return. So these are pretty harsh laws. So they decide to leave. The revolutionary leaders in both Georgia and South Carolina made efforts to capture or attack the refugees. They all failed. When they got to Georgia, General Robert Howe, who was the Continental commander, is trying to get the Georgia Continentals to go after these guys, but the refugees are mounted, and the Georgia Continentals are infantry. They're not going to catch them. There are several other groups of loyalists who had planned to leave, but didn't get ready soon enough. So there are groups of several hundred. But because the revolutionary militia has now been called out, they can't make the journey. They're going to have to wait because they will be dispersed if they try. This gentleman here is General Augustine Prevost. He is a Swiss-born officer at British service. He's the younger brother of James Prevost, who is extremely influential he created the Royal American Regiment during the French and Indian War. Prevost is not as aggressive as Tonin, and they feud about that. But when the refugees get there, Prevost knows he needs them because East Florida has limited ability to defend itself. So the refugees show up and they said, Lord William Campbell, when he met with Robinson in 1775 at Dorchester, granted commissions and authority to recruit and promised us certain pay and benefits for provincial service. We want to be organized as a military unit on Campbell's terms. Prevost says, fine, I can use this extra regiment. And so he assigns his younger brother, Lieutenant Colonel James Mark Prevost, to train them. And they are placed on the provincial establishment as the South Carolina Royalists. There are originally 10 companies, 8 of infantry and 2 of mounted riflemen. So it's a pretty large unit, and they almost immediately go into action. Joseph Robinson, at the request of the men, as having been their leader in the backcountry, is Lieutenant Colonel. McLaurin becomes major. He transfers. He had been in the Florida Rangers. He transfers to the Royalists. A lot of Ranger officers and some enlisted men transfer to the Royalists. A lot of the refugees enlist in the Rangers, and some don't enlist in any unit. So they go into action. The Americans invade East Florida. This is their 3rd time. They invaded in 1776, but never got out of Georgia. 1777, they got a little farther. 1778, they go farther. You know what gets me? You read this, you read the accounts of these invasions, and the American commanders, oh, the sickness caused by the heat. Oh, the heat is miserable. Oh, our men are lacking water. You live in South Carolina, Georgia, North Carolina, and Virginia, and you invade Florida 3 years in a row, every time in the summer. You should know better. How about invading in November when it's cool? But no, they constantly invade in the summer, and the Americans force the Browns Rangers to abandon Fort Tonin. Then at Alligator Creek, they are pursuing Browns Rangers, and the British have a position with the Royalists and some other British troops protecting a bridge over Alligator Creek, and the Royalists and the British troops repel an attack. This is an author's imaginary view of it, although it's probably fairly accurate. So the Americans are repelled with what we would consider light losses for most actions at the time. Certainly nothing compared to a Monmouth or a Brandywine, but the Americans are nevertheless repelled, and the whole invasion falls apart. The governor of Georgia is in personal command of the Georgia militia, and he says, I won't take orders from Robert Howe, the Continental commander, or from any other officer. I control my own militia. So Andrew Williamson says, well, if that's the case, I control my South Carolina militia, and I'm not taking orders from anybody else either. The naval commander, he's carrying some troops along the inland waterways, shows up, and he hears that. He says, well, the Navy's not taking orders from any land officer, governor, general, whatever. We don't care. So Howe says, well, does anybody want to do anything? And the men are complaining about the heat, and they're running short of supplies. So they finally agree to go back. And that gives more time to train the Royalists and get them properly uniformed and equipped and whatnot. And they continue to gain experience. In mid-November of 1778, Prevost makes a foray into southern Georgia, and the Royalists participate in that. They see action in several skirmishes in the Midway and Newport area. Then Prevost withdraws, but when he gets back to St. Augustine, he's got a letter waiting for him from Henry Clinton saying, I'm sending Archibald Campbell down to try to capture Georgia. I need you to march overland and meet him near Savannah. The Royalists and the other Florida troops, about 900 altogether, of which the Royalists are about a third, march north in late December. It's a pretty tough march. They run short of provisions. They have to eat oysters, sometimes kill an alligator for lunch, but they make it up there. On the way, they capture this position here. You see is an earthwork fort at Sunbury, which at the time was Georgia's second most busy port. And they capture Fort Morris on January 9th. So another success for them. They will continue to campaign in 1779. They will march to Augusta with Archibald Campbell. Then he will withdraw in February. Also in February, the Royalists will gain a second battalion, although not and the second battalion will eventually be folded in the first. Colonel James Boyd had accompanied Campbell. He is a South Carolinian. He goes to the backcountry and recruits another roughly 600 North and South Carolina Loyalists and he's got a commission as a provincial officer. He's supposed to meet Campbell at Augusta, but as he's marching to Augusta, Campbell doesn't know where he is. He doesn't get the messages. So Campbell withdraws from Augusta. He's too far away from the coastal area where Prevost is. The army's divided, and the Americans, now under Benjamin Lincoln, could easily cross the Savannah River between the two forces and possibly defeat them. So Campbell decides to withdraw. As Boyd is looking for Campbell, he is attacked at Kettle Creek, and only 270 of his men reach the British. Most of them become the second battalion of the Royalists, surrender, and that will last he can accept. So he for about 6 months, and it's Stono Ferry you see over here. The Americans are repulsed, and that brings the Royalists fight at Briar Creek in March, where the Americans are badly defeated. Their forces to Georgia. And they also take part in the British expedition to Charleston that began in April of 1779. Prevost, facing an attack that he knows he can't repel, decides he's going to turn the tables by marching all the way to Charleston, which he does. Where the Royalists again find themselves in action. In September, completely unexpected, the Comte d'Estaing and his French fleet arrives off Savannah and begins landing about 4,000 troops. Benjamin Lincoln comes down and they besiege the town. The Royalists and other defenders work on the fortifications. They work in the defensive lines. And some of the Royalists are stationed in the Spring Hill Redoubt. The French and American leaders believe this is the key to the line, and they are tired of the siege. It's not getting anywhere, so they decide on October 9th, they're going to storm the lines with the main effort at the Spring Hill Redoubt. The Royalists and other troops in there manage to repulse repeated assaults. They earn great distinction again. Afterwards, many people referred to the Spring Hill Redoubt as the Carolina Redoubt in honor of the Royalists who defended it. And of course, after that, Lincoln blames d'Estaing for not doing enough. d'Estaing blames Lincoln, and both sides pack up and go away. In the spring of 1780, the Royalists returned to South Carolina. They march overland to join Henry Clinton's army besieging Charleston. Colonel Alexander Innes now assumes command of the regiment. He had been given nominal command when it was formed, but he was also Inspector General of Provincial Troops, an administrative position, and he was in New York for most of that. He came down for the capture of Savannah. There's no indication he even saw his regiment there or met his officers. He then went to London to bring in the report of the victory, and then back to New York. Now he shows up and he leads the Royalists into the backcountry where most of the men are furloughed. They've been in service for 2 years and they want some time at home. Surprisingly, many veterans leave the unit and opt to serve in their local militia, Loyalist militia units. So the Royalists, after the summer of 1780, have very few of the veterans they had before. Joseph Robinson, he is apparently, whether he's miffed that Innes is now taking command or whether he's tired, he starts doing other duties, but he no longer associates with the Royalists. So although he's still nominally lieutenant colonel of the regiment. McLaurin is eventually assigned to recruit a 2nd battalion, but he is replaced as well, partly because Cornwallis is really impressed at first with Innes, and also has some other officers, Thomas Fraser of the New York Volunteers, who he moves to the Royalists as major, who he likes very much. And he thinks, these officers will make the unit much better. Well, Innes is going to prove to be a big disappointment. The Royalists are posted at 96. They're recruiting men to replace the ones who had left. On August 19th, about 200 partisans, American partisans, decide to attack a Loyalist militia position at Musgrove's Mill on the Inori River. Before they can get there and plan their attack, Innes, with 50 Royalists, 250 other provincial troops, joins the 200 militia over there. So now, instead of a surprise attack on 200 Loyalist militia, they're facing an additional 300 provincial troops. Well, Innes learns of the American position and decides he's going to attack them. He does one smart thing. He takes all his men. But he does a very stupid thing. He doesn't reconnoiter the American position. He's just going to charge and get them. He's got, maybe you want to call it the pre-Bunker Hill mentality. We could just charge uphill and roust these people. And so Innes charges up the hill, and the Americans are in the fringe of the woods. They've stacked logs and other things to make some defensive works. And the provincial troops advancing across the open field begin to get shot down. They stop and fire a volley way too early, 150 yards away from the Americans. That's almost double the effective range of their muskets. Then they fix bayonets and charge. Innes is wounded, Fraser is wounded, and 60 British soldiers are killed, 90 wounded, 70 taken prisoner. These are substantial losses. American losses, the figures vary depending on who wrote about it, but a total of about 15 killed and wounded. Now, the American partisans learn shortly after that Gates has been defeated at Camden and the Continentals are retreating, that Sumter has been almost annihilated at Fishing Creek. So they have to retreat. But they've inflicted a serious blow of attrition that the British, with the limited number of professional troops, can afford. Innes's reputation is pretty much ruined after this. Cornwallis is eager. As soon as Henry Clinton says, "Hey, I'd like Innes back to do his Inspector General stuff in New York," Cornwallis is like, "Well, hurry up and get well soon, Innes, and go away." He still trusts Fraser, though. Well, the Royalists spend some time at 96, now under Major Thomas Fraser, once he recovers from his Musgrove's wound. Then they're sent to Camden late in 1780. Lieutenant Colonel George Turnbull of the New York Volunteers is commanding there at the time, and he is very upset with the condition of the regiment. He says, they've got a couple hundred men on the rolls. He says about 90 capable of doing duty. A lot of the men are sick. They're just, they have disciplinary problems. So he's not happy. Eventually they're sent back to 96. And finally, in the spring of 1781, after Guilford Courthouse, when Nathaniel Greene takes his army into South Carolina, Lord Rawdon, who's commanding at Camden, summons the Royalists to 96, and there they will perform fairly well. Rawdon attacks Greene on Hobkirk's Hill on April 25th. The Royalists, is not much said about them, but apparently they are sent west of the Great Wagon Road, where they engage the Virginia Continentals. The Virginians got into confusion. We're not sure how. The reports from that side of the road are really poor from both sides. But the Royalists do participate, and Greene is driven back. So they see action there. Afterwards, the British are really short of cavalry. They only sent 2 regular regiments to America, and in 1779, they recalled one to Britain. They've been making up for it by the Queen's Rangers has a cavalry arm, the British Legion has a cavalry arm. They need more provincial cavalry. They have tried in the South to arm the New York Volunteers. Now, wealthy loyalists in Charleston raise several thousand pounds to create a cavalry unit, and they decide to mount the Royalists. Rawdon tells the Royalists, this is because of your great performance at Hobkirk's Hill, although it's more likely since the money came from South Carolina people that he felt, well, we should mount the South Carolina troops with it. So about May 1781, after Camden is evacuated, the British head back towards Charleston. They convert the Royalists to cavalry, and they immediately take part in the relief expedition to raise the siege of 96 in June. Greene is surprised. He writes to Sumter. He says, where did all this enemy cavalry come from? He didn't realize that they had mounted this additional regiment except for one company. And by fall, although the British are confined in the vicinity of Charleston, the Royalists will make frequent raids into the countryside. There'll be a lot of skirmishes with Greene's cavalry, so they will remain active. Another disaster for them, Parker's Ferry on August 30th, 1781. The Royalist cavalry is escorting a large foraging party that has gone out to gather food for the Charleston garrison and the civilians. There's a Hessian officer in command of the whole force because there's a Hessian regiment, also some artillery. They're returning to Charleston, and at sunset, they are at Parker's Ferry crossing a river. And Francis Marion has figured they're heading this way, and he has concealed his men in the swamp along a causeway. Perfect ambush. He sends out a few men to try to attract attention. It works well for them. On the other side of the causeway is some Loyalist militia under Patrick Cunningham. And Patrick Cunningham's men see some of Marion's men. They start shooting just as the main force is coming up. And the Hessian officer says, oh, it looks like rebels on the causeway. Maybe better clear them. Fraser says, sure. Charges. Horsemen packed tightly on a causeway, and Marion's men in the swamp, and they just shoot them to pieces. Marion said he would have destroyed them even better, but some of his men who he had ordered to move up once the action began thought they were being outflanked in the twilight and panicked, and instead started withdrawing, and that panic spread to some of the other men. But it's a disaster. At least 20 of the Royalist cavalrymen are killed and 40 wounded. So not a great moment for them. John Harrison's Rangers, an almost unknown unit, although it turns out there's a fair amount of information on them, but a lot of it is false. William Dobine James, who served, and his father was a major under Francis Marion, and he was a private. When he wrote his memoirs after, he said Harrison and his brothers lived in a log hut along Lynch's River. He said, and they didn't even have any furniture. They slept on the ground covered with animal skins. Well, if you look at Harrison's Loyalist claim, he actually had several hundred acres. He had a nice farmhouse. He had a wife. He had children. He even had a still to make corn liquor. He had other plots of land, some planted in indigo. He was actually, in our terms today, based on his Loyalist claim amount, worth over $400,000. He was a pretty prominent, successful guy, and he was only in his mid-20s. Once the British seize Savannah, he leaves his home and joins the British in Georgia, where he is assigned to carry messages between the Loyalists in the Cheraw, PD area east of Camden and the British. So he will continue to do that. When the British march from Savannah to join the siege of Charleston, he accompanies them. He goes home, and then on June 4th of 1780, he shows up at Camden, meets Lord Cornwallis, and offers to raise a provincial regiment. He tells Cornwallis, I can raise 500 men in the area east of Camden. Cornwallis is impressed, so he appoints him major, commanding the South Carolina Provincial Rangers, approves the plan, and then things quickly go sour. The Rangers very quickly, even though they've got no training or uniforms at the time. They escort the 71st Regiment to Chiraw. They see some people, revolutionaries hiding in the bushes. They see some supplies that have been hidden in swamps. And the 71st Regiment is posted at Chiraw, not only to control that area, but to protect the Rangers while they're recruiting and to help organize and train the recruits with veteran officers. Why doesn't it work? Because the Scots start getting sick from malaria very quickly, and they literally dozens are incapacitated. Many are dying, and Major MacArthur, commanding the 71st, writes to Lord Rawdon at Camden. He says, my men are dying, what do I do? Rawdon says, move them to Black River, maybe it'll be healthier. He moves them there, it doesn't work. Rawdon says, well, bring them to Camden. So there are no British troops in northeastern South Carolina. Who's out there? Francis Marion. And Marion already has the existing militia unit under the revolutionary government. So he is able to skirmish with Harrison's men, and they have no protection, no training. They're going to be kept nearer to Camden. As a result, it's going to be difficult to recruit. Nobody wants to join and take a risk, or at least not many do, with Marion active in the area. So Harrison seldom has more than 100 men in his unit at any time, and usually less. So he never gets the 500 at once that he hoped to get. Now, the Rangers take part in many activities against Marion. In September 1780, you might remember, Major James Weems in the 63rd Regiment is sent to scour that PD Williamsburg County area to drive out Marion and his men. Marion is actually forced to withdraw into North Carolina, and this is when they burn 40 or 50 homes of Marion's followers. The Rangers participate in this, and they act as guides. They help distinguish between loyalists and revolutionaries. So they take part in that. In November, Cornwallis sends Tarleton and the British Legion to operate against Marion. The Rangers again join him. He is unable to bring Marion to battle. That's one advantage. Marion, like Washington, knew you do not fight at a disadvantage because you have nothing to gain. So Marion avoided combat. The Rangers apparently did a very good job. Tarleton praised them to Rawdon and Cornwallis, and Rawdon and Cornwallis afterwards said, boy, these loyalists are really good. So their contributions were solid. In early 1781, Lieutenant Colonel John Watson of the Guards, who commands a composite unit from different regiments of light infantry companies called the Provincial Light Infantry, they've been sent south. Watson goes to Camden, says to Lord Rawdon, I need to build a base. You want me to operate against Marion? I've got to have a base, and I need cavalry. Rawdon assigns him some of the Rangers, who show him the Indian Mound on the Santee River, where they build Fort Watson. From this post, Watson operates against Marion's partisans with fair effect. They also engage Sumter a few times when he's passing through with some effectiveness. And the part of the Rangers will be assigned to the garrison and defend the fort until Marion and Henry Lee capture it on April 23rd. The Rangers play a bigger part earlier in March in the Bridges campaign, when Rawdon is trying to bring Marion to battle. The 64th Regiment, the Provincial Light Infantry, Loyalist militia, the Rangers go out in search of Marion. They fight at Waibu Swamp and Mount Hope Swamp. They're driving Marion back, but not inflicting heavy losses. On March 20th, Watson suffers fairly heavy losses, although he drives Marion back again at the Sanpit River Bridge. And at that point, Watson decides to go to Georgetown because it's the same distance as if he goes back to Fort Watson. And in Georgetown, he can get provisions and rest his men from this difficult campaign. So the Rangers will go there. And but this does have some effect, because while Marion is busy fighting Watson, Rawdon sends out another column that sneaks up on Marion's camp at Snow's Island, frees a couple of dozen prisoners, kills or captures a bunch of small number, but some of Marion's men. And depending on whose account you read, either Marion's men throw the gunpowder and musket balls and other supplies into the river before the British capture it, or the British take it and destroy it. But in any case, Marion loses his supplies. He's actually left in pretty bad shape and is considering another withdrawal to North Carolina after this campaign, when Greene shows up and sends Lee and his legion to cooperate with Marion. So it wasn't a total success, but it had some effect, at least in, preventing Marion from holding the initiative. Well, when Camden is evacuated in May 1781, the Rangers are going to be cut off. So most of the Rangers, with Harrison and 200 to 300 other loyalists from that area east of Camden, fall back to the British lines at Charleston. Fall of 1781, the Rangers are incorporated into the Royalists, except for one independent troop under Harrison himself, although that is going to later be incorporated into the Royalists. I think it's important to note, Cornwallis was very harsh or could be very harsh in his judgment of Loyalists. He called them dastardly and pusillanimous in one of his letters. He disparaged a lot of their officers. Harrison, who, usually when he is mentioned at all, usually gets a bad rap. Cornwallis, when he wrote in support of Harris's Loyalist claim, spoke very highly of him. He says, I really believe that during the whole time he raised 300 men and that he did everything possible and fought with valor and zeal. And that's unusual. The only other person he was that generous in praising was John Harris Kruger, who commanded the 96th garrison. The others, put it this way, if you get a recommendation to the Claims Commission from somebody other than Cornwallis, you probably wanted to do that. But he was very generous in his assessment of Harrison. The last group, the Provincial Light Dragoons, again, trying to meet the cavalry shortage. The British decide to create 3 troops, again, the equivalent of 3 infantry companies, about 40 men each, of Provincial Light Dragoons in South Carolina. The officers are Captain Edward Fenwick, also a colonel in the Loyalist militia. He is a South Carolinian. The other 2, another Archibald Campbell, not the one who was in Georgia. Apparently Archibald Campbell at this time is the Scottish equivalent of John Smith. It's just a really, really common name. Lachlan McLean, another British officer, commands the 3rd troop. His troop is mostly in garrison duty. They don't do a lot. This is William Hardin here of the South Carolina militia. Campbell's troop usually served alongside the Royalists. Campbell himself is killed in action. Stephen Jarvis, a Connecticut Loyalist, will assume command. McLean's troop is generally out on Johns Island, James Island, somewhere in garrison. Fenwick's troop is really effective. In early April, they meet Hardin twice and beat him badly. And then what happens on April 13th? Fenwick is out near Fort Balfour on the Pocotaligo River. He goes to a tavern, which is being used as a hospital, to check on his men. Marion shows up, and Marion's men show up. Marion isn't there, but Hardin and others are. And they show up, they capture him before he can get back to the fort. And then they surround the fort. They begin negotiating for surrender. Some of the defenders want to fight. They believe they can win, and they probably could have. Fenwick at the time is still a staunch Loyalist. He says, I hope to see them in hell if they surrender that fort without a fight, but they surrender. Of course, Fenwick is going to change his mind. He is later going to agree to become a spy for Greene. And when he submits his Loyalist claim, they first approve it. And then when word gets out, when the state had confiscated his property as a Loyalist, then lo and behold, he shows up and says, look, here's my letter from Greene. See, he said, I'm not to be punished. I was helping. And of course, word gets back to Britain, and Cornwallis writes, I always considered him a man of broken fortune and a scoundrel, and, take his, award away, which they do. And the Loyalist Claims Commission says, it would be good if the justice of either the United States or Britain could get someone who is, so devious. But so Fenwick didn't do well. The cavalry is consolidated when, after Yorktown, Major General Alexander Leslie shows up in Charleston to command in the South. And he's got all these cavalry units, militia, provincials, royalists, rangers. He says, I'm just going to consolidate them. There's too many of them. It's too disorganized. So at that point, the rest of the Rangers and the Provincial Light Dragoons are incorporated into the Royalists. And in late 1781, they get a new boost. This guy is Benjamin Thompson. He is a New England Loyalist. He left at the evacuation of Boston and became a deputy to Lord George Germain, the Secretary of State for America, who was the civilian official in charge of running the war. As the war is winding down, Thompson has always wanted to be an officer in the field. So Germain, who's going to be dismissed or forced to resign when North's government falls after Yorktown, knows he's on the way out. So he uses his last bit of influence, gets Thompson appointed as commander, lieutenant colonel, to command a regiment of light dragoons on Long Island. But Thompson's ship, because of bad weather, ends up in Charleston. He's sick. He can't do anything. When he feels better, he goes to see Leslie, says, hey, I'm here. Can I help? Well, he says, why don't you take care of the cavalry? Thompson, despite no military experience, proves an outstanding commander. He starts training his troops, getting them to work together, getting better horses for them, and then starting to make forays into the countryside to give them more action. And this is supposed to be this illustration, Wembaugh Bridge, although it doesn't look like it to me, but there's a lot of these actions, there aren't any. When Thompson thinks his troops are ready, he undertakes a major raid on February 24th, 1782. And at Wembaugh Bridge, he soundly defeats Marion's men. Marion is not there. Marion has been elected to the South Carolina Senate. He's attending the legislature. But when Marion learns that Thompson's out and targeting his men, he leaves the legislature, goes to take command of his troops, which he does the next day, February 25th. And he fights Thompson again at Tidyman's plantation, and Thompson beats him again and captures Marion's tent and even brags. He says, I got Marion's personal supply of whiskey. So although I understand Marion was a teetotaler, so the whiskey probably belonged to some other officer, but in any case, Thompson has turned this cavalry into a fairly effective force, but then he goes back to New York. Fraser resumes command of the Royalist cavalry. They conduct occasional raids, various skirmishes. Sometimes they do really well, other times not so well. They meet Marion for the last time in August 1782 at Wadbu Barony. Fraser fails to drive off the Americans, but they won't attack him either. So they both stand and look at each other for an hour after the initial action. And then Fraser says, all right, back to Charleston. And in October, the provincial troops go to St. Augustine. The South Carolina provincials disperse throughout the empire. Some go to Britain, some go to the West Indies, most go to what's now Nova Scotia. Joseph Robinson actually goes to Nova Scotia, but then Edward Fanning, another loyalist who's a friend of his, says, why don't you come to what became Prince Edward Island, where he was, and Robinson becomes an important official in the early history of Prince Edward Island. Only a handful returned to South Carolina. So thank you very much for your attention, and I think Andrew's handling the questions.
This was a lovely talk, and as someone who studies Maryland, I find it just so interesting. Nothing this exciting happens in Maryland during the war. So the question I have is whether you would say that the British effectively used the Loyalist forces, whether they could have used them more effectively, that would have given them the possibility of holding the South.
I think as far as provincial troops went, they used the provincials pretty effectively. The Royalists did good service for the most part, and some of their failures can be blamed on poor leadership. Now, Harrison's Rangers, I think, could have been very effective. That was a circumstance completely out of any British officer's control, disease. And that's one of the things, actually, as Andrew knows, they're doing a Saving Soldiers exhibit at Historic Camden, where I am, and I've been doing a lot of research for that, for supplementary material related to the South. And I'd also worked on a medically related exhibit for that group earlier. And that really opened my eyes to something that I had never really considered, which was the effect of disease on the British Army in the Southern campaign. At the time of the Battle of Camden, for example, Cornwallis takes the field against Horatio Gates with 2,400 men. He has 800 more sick in the hospital who are too sick to move. Who he said, if I had to evacuate Camden, I'd have to leave these 800 men there under a flag of truce as prisoners. 800 men. Look at the disaster that the Americans suffered at Camden. If Cornwallis had 800 more regular British troops, yeah, I mean, there might have been nothing left. So the case with Harrison's Rangers is really out of their control. The problem really was, and some historians have pointed this out, was that the British early in the war, when they could have formed a lot of provincial units where the volunteers were there, didn't want to do it. William Howe especially, he did not, he had served in the French and Indian War. He did not have much respect for American soldiers as a result of his experience then. And he literally had to have his arm twisted by Germain in London or by prominent loyalists like the Delanceys and the Krugers in New York to say, hey, if you're not going to encourage us, at least let us recruit these units and take them. Because he figured, I can do this. I've got 30,000 British and Hessian troops. I don't need these Americans. So they missed some opportunities. In the South, it's interesting. A couple of historians have said that if Governor Campbell in South Carolina, instead of retreating to his Navy ship in Charleston Harbor and complaining that he was powerless, had been courageous enough to go in person to the backcountry and raise the Loyalists there, he may have had a chance of holding that region and keeping the rebels pinned to the coast. But by the time they start raising provincial troops in the South, it's relatively late in the war. Tonin had to raise the East Florida Rangers and pay them out of his colonial treasury because the British Army didn't want them. So, so they missed opportunities along the way. But sometimes, the provincials did a lot for them.
Yeah, Jim, good talk. I have a question about who issued the beating orders and the commissions. So it was my understanding that they either came from the commander-in-chief of British forces in North America or the commander-in-chief of British forces in Canada. Was East and West Florida separate from the North American commander-in-chief, or did they have their own?
East and West Florida were still answerable to Gage, then Howe, then Clinton. But they didn't get a lot of attention from those commanders who felt that their focus had to be elsewhere. So the governors and the military officers were semi-independent. For example, when Prevost at the end of April decides he's going to upset Lincoln's plans by marching into South Carolina, Clinton has no idea. And Clinton is writing to him, what are you doing? Did Germain tell you to do this? And Prevost tries to write him letters, but there's no vessel to carry them. So by the time Prevost writes his first letter, almost a month, like 2 or 3 weeks after he's gone into South Carolina, he can't even mail it. So he writes another letter 3 weeks after that and says, I still haven't had a chance to send my letter of such and such a date, but I'll update you as long as I'm doing this. So they're under the command, but it's hard to exercise command at that distance. And these commanders in their New York headquarters feel that they have other priorities and that these are sort of backwater theaters.
I have a question. Major Patrick Ferguson's Loyalist militia, were they raised from South Carolina residents or some of the backcountry? Where did they come from?
Ferguson's militia were almost entirely raised in South Carolina. At Kings Mountain, he had about, the accounts differ, but let's say 200 recent North Carolina recruits when he had been out in that area trying to intercept Elijah Clark, who was retreating from Augusta. And he picked up about 200 recruits, maybe from North Carolina, but his militia was all South Carolina, a 96th district, basically backcountry militia.
I have a few questions. For those of us who aren't as steeped in this as apparently most people in the room are, I need a little context. I'm from South Carolina. Was it always called backcountry? Because South Carolinians will say the word upcountry really to describe that part of the state. So is that different from the time?
The documents at the time generally say backcountry, back parts, back settlements.
And how far much of the state is covered by that term?
Basically,
Columbia North?
if you want to say the low country, think Georgetown and the surrounding area and follow that south to Beaufort, Port Royal. That is sort of the settled low country at the time. And then you've got sort of a intermediate area that's not, it's still, I would call those slightly interior areas still, they were more closely associated with the low country. But once you start getting out, Orangeburg is considered the back country at this time. Camden, definitely back country. Cheraw is sort of PD, sort of in the middle. I don't know if it really fits a categorization at that time. It's never referred to as either that I've seen. But yeah, generally pretty much 50 miles from the coast would be the low country. It's just a ballpark estimate.
And in terms of, can you give us a context? Well, about how many years was there enough concern that there could be this type of desire to break away from England? How far before 1775?
Well, at first, the first protests really come with the Stamp Act in 1765. The British, of course, their national debt has doubled fighting the French and Indian / 7 Years' War. And they have raised taxes in Britain proper to the point where they had some actual rebellions domestically, and they had to pull back on some of the taxation. So they are desperate for funds, and they look at the colonies, and the colonies known for decades smuggle with the French, with the Spanish, with the Dutch, rather than trade within the empire. They actually, in cities like New York during the French and Indian War, they used to bid to the governors and other officials for flags of truce. If they'd capture a Spanish privateer or merchant vessel with a crew of 25 men, the Spanish would exchange them. The French would exchange them the same way. Would they send all 25 French sailors back in one ship? No, they said one at a time with a ship loaded with contraband to collect that hard currency from the enemy. So the British are pretty upset with this wartime smuggling. They feel it actually has lengthened the war. And so they said, well, first we're going to try to crack down on smuggling. We're going to lower the tax on foreign molasses. We're going to cut it by 2/3 to get them to pay it, and rather than risk smuggling. Well, that didn't have much effect. So then they said to the colonies, look, we need revenue. You guys are paying, I'm trying to remember what the amount was, but it's some, in taxes to Britain proper, the average colonist paid something like 6 pence per year, and the average person in Britain paid 25 shillings. But the average colonist was far wealthier than the average person in Britain. So they said, well, figure out a way to tax yourself to help us out. Did they come up with anything? No, all of the legislature said, no, no ideas here. So I said, all right, well, we'll try this stamp act. They said, well, you can't do that. That's against the Constitution. Only our own legislatures can tax us. So that caused a problem, but all the protests always said, we're loyal to the king, we're loyal to Britain. You know, we're just concerned about this one tax. So the British said, okay, we'll repeal the tax. And when Franklin testified in Parliament about it, they said, what about customs duties? He said, oh, no, we don't mind paying customs duties. That's the price we pay for the Royal Navy's protection for our ships, our trade. So in 1767, the British imposed customs duties. And what do the Americans say? Oh, wait, this is an unconstitutional tax because, and John Dickinson, you know, he's a lawyer when he came up with this one. He said, customs duties are constitutional if they regulate trade, but not if they're intended to raise a revenue. That is legal hair splitting. How does a customs duty regulate trade but not raise revenue at the same time? So they said, well, we're not going to pay it. We're going to boycott, but we're loyal. We want everything. So the British repealed everything but the tea tax. Excuse me. And in 1773, you get the Tea Act, which doesn't change the tax on tea. What it does is it's a corporate bailout. We've seen that. We've seen that Alexander Hamilton engineered the first bank bailout during Washington's administration. The Treasury had to bail out the first bank of the United States. So, you know, bailouts are no big thing, but the East India Company, which is basically running the India for the benefit of the British Empire, but as a private concern, is corrupt, and they're about to go bankrupt and they can't sell their tea. So the British say, okay, we're going to bail you out. We're going to streamline all these laws for the sale of tea and leave the tax the same, and help the East India Company. The Americans say, this is a trick because you want us to pay the tea tax, although actually they had been paying it for a fair amount, even in Boston. But now they say, oh no, you're trying to lower the price of tea so that we'll pay the tea tax. And once we pay the tea tax, we've surrendered the principle and you'll tax everything. So they throw the tea in the harbor, and that's when the British said, enough. You know, we've tried every compromise that we could think of. And, you know, that's when the British start thinking about this time that maybe the Americans are aiming for independence. I think some American leaders had independence in the back of their mind, but it really isn't until the British passed the coercive acts in response to the Tea Party. And then you get the fighting in New England that people really start thinking, you know, we've got to separate. So really the movement for independence doesn't take any steam until 1776.
Thanks. And your pronunciation was pretty good, but the name of that river is Pocataligo.
Oh, okay. So I'm a New Englander, so I do the same thing when people say Lexington and Concord, and I say, what? It's Concord. So thank you for that.
So it is often estimated that at the time of the Revolution that roughly a third of the population in the colonies were patriot, for want of a better word, a third loyalist and a third non-committal in between. It seems that the British by the late 1770s, 1780s had come to believe that in South Carolina, Georgia, and East Florida, and so on, that ratio tilted more in their favor. Is there any reason to believe that that might have been the case in your study, or was it pretty much as it was elsewhere?
Now, it's very uneven. So, for example, in New England and Virginia, there aren't a whole lot of loyalists. In Pennsylvania, there's a moderate amount. In the southernmost colonies, particularly South Carolina and Georgia, and in New York and New Jersey, you have a large number of loyalists, much larger than you would have. Loyalists are never a threat. In New England, Governor Wentworth says, I'm going to form a provincial regiment in New Hampshire. He gets like 50 guys, you know? So I mean, there's just not the support there. You know, the same thing in Massachusetts. You know, there are some people, but not much. But in the South, because of these pre-existing divisions, and a lot of these choosing sides for either side is not really based on these issues we talked about at the Revolution. It's based on local issues. So for a lot of the people in the backcountry, if these low country planters who don't care about us at all are for the Revolution, then we're taking the other side. We see the same thing Eastern Shore, Maryland, where there are a lot of loyalists, not in the rest of Maryland, but Eastern Shore, there's quite a few, but they feel they're neglected by the colonial legislature too. Hudson River Valley, all the descendants, the Schuyler's and the Livingstons, the descendants of the Dutch and some of the others, own these big manors worked by tenant farmers. When these people declare for the Revolution, the owners of the manors, a lot of their tenant farmers go up the Hudson to Canada and sign up to fight for the British because they feel they've been abused by these people. And so obviously the other guy must be a better option. So, so there are a lot of local issues. And then there are a lot of people who you read there, they seriously believe that America is better off under the British Empire, that together, and I think that's a good, solid argument, that together, Britain and the colonies are much stronger than they are separately, economically, politically, militarily. So, and I mean, a lot of those fears that they had that somehow they were going to lose all their liberty, and that they were going to become like, say, like the peasants in Russia in wooden shoes and uncut hair. I mean, that didn't happen. It didn't happen in Britain either. I mean, you know, Britain still kept its version of freedom, and in Canada, which was basically founded by the Loyalists, you know, after the war. I mean, they've done okay too. I mean, we don't see anybody in the English speaking world living like the Russians did, you know, not abolishing serfdom till 1862. So.
Thank you for a great presentation. Why did the fighting in South Carolina continue well after Cornwallis surrender in Yorktown in October 1781? And also, what happened to the many American soldiers that were imprisoned in British boats in Charleston Harbor?
Okay, first part of the question, why does the fighting continue? At first, nobody's sure the war is going to end just because Cornwallis surrendered. That's a decision that Britain has to make. It's government ministers, the king, parliament. King George III does not want to end the war. He's ready to give up his throne and abdicate rather than make peace. It's only, you know, through great persuasion does he agree to let parliament go ahead, and parliament doesn't vote until 1782 to end offensive operations in America. And so that, I think it's January or February that vote is made. And so figure another month at least before that word reaches America. So, so nobody could be sure the war is exactly over. So people are going to try to get an edge. Part of that, and this is one of Nathaniel Greene's major concerns, is what happens. There had been efforts by Austria and Russia to negotiate a peace, and France had already signed on to that. You can mediate. And they had pretty much convinced Congress to sign on. Interestingly, Britain had, the Southern campaign got off to a good start, so they held off on the mediation. If they had taken it at the time, the plan was to have everybody keep what they had, which would have meant at the time, Georgia and South Carolina definitely stay within the British Empire, and probably New York City and the area around it, Long Island, although there was talk of trading that for, say, North Carolina. So there was always the idea, and Greene was very conscious of this, that he had to keep the pressure on to show that, and that's why he tells Georgia and South Carolina's civilian leaders, reconstitute your civilian governments as soon as you can to show legitimate control of your states, so that if there is a mediated peace, that your state won't be handed over to Britain as part of the mediation because they're seen to control it. And then there are just some tough people who don't want to quit. Some of Harrison's people who didn't go to Charleston continued after the peace. They were still fighting with some of Marion's former people in the PD region. So there was a lot of, animosity. They were eventually released. In Charleston, they recruited some for service against Spain. One of the former royal governors came back and said, "You want to get off the prison ship? Sign up for military service with us." And they said, "No, we don't want to fight against our fellow Americans." He said, "Well, how about fighting against the French?" They said, "Well, the French are sort of our ally." Well, how about fighting against Spain, which Spain was never formally allied with the United States. Spain was only an ally of France. So they did give the United States assistance, but they never recognized American independence at that time or allied. And, there's long hatred of both the British and Americans for Spain going back to the Armada era. So they said, sure. So several hundred signed up for service against Spain. Others died. The prison ships were terrible. The ration for a prisoner of war enlisted man, and the officers were treated well. The officers were put at Mount Pleasant. So they were put in people's houses. They could write home and get money. They could go shopping in Charleston if they had money or credit. But the enlisted men were jammed aboard these ships. By international law at the time, a prisoner of war, enlisted man, was given 2/3 of the ration of the soldiers who had captured him. So they got 2/3 the rations of a British soldier. But when there was disruptions in supplies from Europe or something, and the British soldiers' rations were cut, the prisoners' rations were cut. They were already lower. I read one really interesting study. A 160-pound man who was completely inactive as a prisoner, receiving the standard ration of 2/3 of what a British soldier got, would still lose 1 pound per week. So you're not going to be healthy. And when you're not well fed, and remember, a lot of that ration is salt beef and things like this, salt pork. So it's not the most nutritious. And then you've got all these people crowded together. You got malaria in the South, which is not as big of a problem as the North. That affects the prisoners as well as the soldiers in the field. And then you've got all of these other diseases like typhus and dysentery. So there's a very high death toll aboard all the prison ships, New York, Charleston, Savannah. So, and, until they agreed to exchange prisoners, and that was not done till relatively late in the war.
Jim, I do want to hit some questions here on Zoom. You, at the end of your presentation, you mentioned that only a handful of Loyalists returned to South Carolina. Can you talk about how they were treated when they returned? Did they assimilate back into society?
Yeah, most of the people who returned were not the leaders. They were not commissioned officers. They were enlisted men or sergeants, or maybe a very low ranking officer. Some of them returned. There's actually an officer who writes to one of Greene's officers and says, "Hey, can I get a pass to go to the Camden area?" He says, "It's an affair of the heart. And, my love doesn't want to leave South Carolina if I evacuate. So I want to go back." So some of these people had ties. If you had local ties with people, a lot of times they'd say, "All right, let's put our differences aside and be accepted." If you were seen as someone who was a little beyond the pale, someone who might have been blamed for carrying out an atrocity or, burning somebody's houses or something like that. So you can imagine Harrison's men who were with Weems in September 1780, and they burned those 40 or 50 homes. Those people, if they had gone back, they might have faced some retribution. James Collins, who was a Revolutionary soldier, said after the war that when some of the Loyalists came back and they didn't like them, what they would do is they'd break into their house at night, throw a blanket over their head, and basically beat them up, smash their house. And that was a notation that you've got to leave. You either got to move out west where people won't know what your background is, or you better, go to another British colony. So it was hard for most people. Interestingly enough, though, Thomas Fraser, who was the commander of the Royalists late in the war, stays in South Carolina, marries a local woman, goes into business. He's a lousy businessman. And so most of his efforts fail, and he eventually moves up to Philadelphia. But Fraser doesn't seem to have suffered at all for being major of the Royalists since the fall of 1780. And that may have been, he married into a prominent family. I don't remember which one, but those connections sometimes could help. If you're a friend of Henry Lawrence, as some of these people were, Henry was influential. So, but some people who stayed, you could be immersed, which meant you had to pay a cash tax up to 15% of your property, and then you were technically forgiven. Or you could be, you could have your property confiscated. And some people were not allowed to return. They were just banished, and they said, we don't want you back here at all. So, but most chose not to go back anyway, which was probably the wisest decision.
Very good. And thankfully you covered a lot of the questions already. So I think that's a great place to wrap up. Jim, I want to thank you again for coming out and speaking tonight. Thank you all for attending in person and as well as online, and for your continued support of our mission. So thank you very much. Get home safe, and we'll see you next time. Take care.